If you happen to be walking through a field or pasture in West Texas, you might come across one of these, a giant concrete arrow. Here's one sitting in a field just north of Odessa. It's not the only one in Texas. Some are hard to see, while others are obvious. Like something out of a science fiction movie, adding to the intrigue, these giant arrows in West Texas are pointing to other giant arrows. So where does the path lead, and what is it for exactly? Here's the answer. This crumbling piece of semen is actually part of an early aviation navigation system, a long-forgotten navigation aid that helped early aviators travel across the country bringing mail. For answers, we go back to 1918 when President Woodrow Wilson sent a letter by plane, launching the United States airmail system. Sending letters by plane was speedy, much better than waiting for a train to cross the country, but there was a big problem. The pilots kept getting lost. Unlike today, rain, snow, and sleet, and especially the darkness of night, brought the postal planes to a screeching and sometimes deadly halt. To solve the problem in the 1920s, America built the first ground-based civilian navigation system in the world, installing giant concrete arrows every 10 miles. There are about 700 nationwide, many still visible from the air, abandoned relics of a time long gone. The brightly painted yellow arrows were just part of the navigation system. The yellow paint's long since gone. Look closely and you can see the remnants of a generator shack and the steel towers that used to rise above the arrows and hold the rotating beacon guiding pilots at night. These beacons stretch from coast to coast to help early airmail pilots navigate the night sky. Malcolm Lang, director of the Texas Air Museum Caprock chapter, says it wasn't an easy feat.
Well, they weren't arrows to begin with. Actually, they were bonfires to begin with. And when they knew that the plane was supposed to be through, they would set a bonfire about every 25 miles apart so that the pilots could identify them and know that they were on course. Later on, as things developed, they ended up putting arrows out to also show the direction that they were supposed to be going.
Even though following a yellow road across the country seemed simple, it was extremely dangerous. The brave pioneer pilots who put it all on the line just to deliver letters, mailed with a 10-cent stamp.
And of course, they're flying in condition, every type of condition, open cockpit biplanes, which were fabric covered. And I've done that, and it's cold. I mean, they've had to help me out of the airplane a couple of times, trying to get landed and get out of the airplane. So they were miserable. Yes, they're getting flying time, and yes, they're doing a real service to begin the early airmail stuff. But in all honesty, it was pretty bad by way of conditions. I mean, some of the engines that they were flying with used castor oil initially. Well, you can imagine what castor oil would do to your digestive system if you're inhaling it a lot. So you'd land and have to use the restroom immediately. Like I said, you'd land and be covered in oil, except for where your goggles were. The conditions weren't great, and they got better when they went to enclosed cockpits and higher quality airplanes and more reliable engines.
The arrows are placed every 10 miles, and in some areas 25 miles, with some having a crude emergency airstrip next to it.
Well, they didn't land every 25 miles. The 25 miles was about, if I flew a line and I had some altitude, I could typically see the next spot. Okay, so typically what we call 10 miles visibility in this area. That's pretty typical. Well, at 10 miles visibility, if I'm holding the course that I was before, okay, I could start seeing that up ahead. So the distance was about the limit of my visibility.
Today's navigation for aviation is a far technological leap from the early days of aviation. With navigational aids, GPS, communications, etc., flying is now the safest form of travel. But back then, the start was a bonfire then a concrete arrow followed by a beacon and a radio aid.
Well, and they added the new technologies, new for them, putting the arrow out, but then they realized that they needed some form of the electrification, so they added generators, which allowed them to light it, put a rotating beacon on some of them, and have a beam, even if it was just nothing but a beep, 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 and you knew as you got closer to it, you were getting closer because it was getting louder. That's, quote, early navigation, cross-country navigation. We laughingly say that all I really need is a Texaco road map, but that's not quite true.
2 routes here in West Texas, one from Fort Worth to El Paso, and the other from Oklahoma through Amarillo to Albuquerque along the I-40 corridor. You can still see many of the aviation arrows dotted along an imaginary line across Texas, all the arrows pointing one way. The pilots would just reverse the route when headed back. The hazards and conditions these pioneer pilots had to face.
Engine failure, icing, flying in cold weather, and raining and ice forming on the wings of the airplane. Those would probably be the 2 biggest things I would think of. Trying to go through thunderstorms, headwinds in West Texas. If you're going west, sometimes you look out and realize that the cars are passing you, and this isn't a modern airplane.
And consider that you're flying long distances at low altitudes in unreliable airplanes covered in nothing more than fabric that literally means covered in cotton, the same type of linen you're wearing in your shirt. For over a decade, the aviation aero routes were without question the most successful aeronautic enterprise in the world. Eventually, however, technology like the radar and GPS made these beacons obsolete, and many were removed in World War II to prevent enemy bombers from navigating the U.S. But all across the country, these concrete arrows remain in history. They pointed east towards safety, towards the destination. But today, the few crumbled remains of these arrows serve as a reminder. The airplane had forever changed America's sense of time. In its 9 years, the airmail flew 14 million miles and carried 300 million letters. With skill, daring, and courage, pilots of the U.S. Airmail Service had overcome the impossible and connected a nation. For Everything Lubbock, I'm Jason Davis.